Welcome, everyone, to this conversation with guests from around the world who are going to share with us about what they've experienced during this wilderness time the last few years. So each person here is going to introduce themselves. I'll start. My name is Sharon Norton, and I work with the Africa and Europe programs for Mennonite Mission Network. And I've been doing this for about 12 years. Before that, I was a mission worker in Germany for 14 years with my husband and our 3 children. I haven't been in the Africa-Europe role for 12 years. I've been at Mission Network for 12 years. Anyway, okay, Linda, to you.
My name is Linda Shelley, and I work with the Latin America programs with Mennonite Mission Network. And today I'll be doing interpretation for Ofelia García from Mexico.
Thank you. Ofelia.
Hola, buenos días. Me da muchísimo gusto estar con ustedes.
Hello, good morning. I'm very happy to be here with you, to be participating. My name is Ofelia García, and I live in the city of Mexico, and I'm a pastor and missionary. Some 40 years. I'm married and have 3 children. 2 of them are pastors and one is a biologist. And I've had the privilege of being a pioneer in the movement of Anabaptist women doing theology from Latin America, and some other activities also that I'm involved in.
Thank you, Mziwandile Nkutha.
Well done, Sharon. You're doing a great job. Thank you. Just to echo what Sharon had said, my name is Mziwandile Nkutha, based in South Africa in a city called Johannesburg. I'm part of the Anabaptist Network in South Africa, a small network that works with different churches and organizations and work alongside community leaders as well. Our role is to foster a practice of peace and justice and aspects of what reconciliation might mean. I've been doing this work now for the past 6 years and have been working alongside different organizations and churches and partner organizations, both in the UK and in North America. So I'll stop here for now.
Thank you for sharing. And Karen.
Well, hello, and thank you so much for this honor to be here. My name is Karen Sethuraman. I'm from Northern Ireland, from Belfast, and so I send greetings from there. I've been in ministry life now for over 20 years. I am currently the first and only female Baptist minister on the island of Ireland, so we have a long way to go. But my work kind of centers and focuses on peace and reconciliation. Northern Ireland is what's regarded as post-conflict. I probably wouldn't agree with that in the sense that we are post-armed conflict, but we're still very much a conflicted people. We're very much a divided people, and we're seeking what it means to live together and to live as neighbors. And so my heart really is for people outside the church walls, and my ministry and the stuff that we do through SoulSpace Peace and Reconciliation Hub centers and focuses on people who feel they don't fit in church. And also on top of all this, I'm also doing a PhD with the Anabaptist Mennonite Network in the UK. Here in Northern Ireland, I think through the lens of the church, our feet is pretty much stuck in the Reformation back in the 16th century when we're identified as either Catholic or Protestant. And I think this presents us with challenges as we move forward into a future of peace, that the church isn't left behind. And so the PhD will center around that and create a framework of reconciliation for us here in Ireland. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, all 3 of you, for being here and for sharing with us. We've created some questions for you ahead of time that you've had a chance to look at. And so we're just going to go through those now. And if you would like to respond in the same order, Ofelia, Mzi, and Karen, we'll go ahead with that. So we've all been stuck in this pandemic for 2 years. COVID has in some ways radically changed our world and our lives. Everyone has experienced it in different ways. It's not the same at all. So speaking of from your context, how would you describe some of the losses, some of the changes and challenges because of this wilderness COVID time? Ofelia, you can start.
It's a simple question because there have been so many losses in the whole world in the midst. In addition to the losses of the pandemic, different kinds of conflict, political level, but personally, I have had the experience of losing people very, very dear to me. Among them, a year ago, my sister died. I accompanied her. She didn't have COVID at first, but then she did in the hospital. And I took her out of the hospital and brought her home, and she died 2 hours later. And we needed to bury her. And then I was immediately in bed with COVID myself. And I've lost friends, I've lost disciples, neighbors, brothers and sisters in Christ. And in the community, it's been very difficult also because we had just started in October with a very beautiful project in this marginal neighborhood with Education for Peace. It's a neighborhood that's very traditional Catholic, and our insertion in the community was through the children. We began to be involved with people and to be accepted through the project that we brought to work towards peace. And God gave us a big space here in this house. It seems as if we're rich because we have a yard and with trees, and many people have a very, very small space. And this is a project here because the children didn't have a place to play. They didn't have a place to have activities. And so we opened up the doors of our house. And so we've felt deeply the losses within the community. And because we've been in confinement and we had to suspend the activities that we were doing. And this gave us has also given us great opportunity to relate with the community. As a church conference, we've also had a lot of losses because the churches had to close and the projects they were doing couldn't continue. And well, it's been a time that is just very sensitive with losses of all types at emotional levels and in relationships with other people. We had to isolate ourselves, but we've also had many opportunities.
Thank you for sharing, and I'm so sorry for your loss of your sister. I'm sure that was devastating, and for the many other losses.
Gracias.
Great. So thank you for that, and thank you for the reflections, Ofelia, and deepest love towards your family and your sister that you've lost. I think, not even I think, in South Africa, we have in total now, this morning I was reflecting, there's close to almost 90,000 plus people that have died since the beginning of the pandemic here in South Africa. And names are no longer statistics, right? So they are very close names of people that you know, church members, community members, significant people that we've journeyed with for quite some time that have passed on. So the pandemic had tremendous impact in terms of both the community and the country at large, but also the church as well. And in terms of going forward with some of the leaders that have been trying by all means to reach out to people who have been vulnerable during the times of the peak of the virus here in South Africa. Some of you would know South Africa has a longest lockdown ever. So we are actually currently still under lockdown under the Disaster Management Act here in South Africa. So the lockdown process has in many ways revealed some of the social ills here in South Africa, which I think were hidden somehow by different aspects, and perhaps it was a facade and a quote unquote a hopeful transition from 1994. Some of you would know the history of South Africa. We transitioned from the apartheid colonial history into a democratic dispensation, 1994, after then the first president, Nelson Mandela. So I won't go into those details, but the 1994 marks a very significant time here in South Africa. But I think what the pandemic has done has revealed the illusionary or the fallacy of the triumphal process of 1994. And it revealed, I think, three things, in my opinion. One, it revealed the ongoing inequality processes here in South Africa, mainly the economic inequality. Two, it also revealed that issues of race have not adequately been addressed here in South Africa. And then three, it also revealed the livelihood of people, and in particular, the vulnerability of Black women here in South Africa, in particular, what has been coined as gender-based violence. And so these three aspects have been quite significant, and I think they could be viewed as the tripartite elements of oppression in South Africa, going back to the history of colonization. So I frame South Africa as a country that has been wounded by colonial history, by colonial violence, because of the structures that we find ourselves. The South African history and its apartheid idea, which was formed in 1948, constructed and defined South Africa from a perspective of what they call the white man's polity. And in so many ways, that perspective has created mostly majority of Black people to reside in the most dilapidated, poor conditions, and the minority of white folk living in affluent communities, and they own much means of production and so forth. So our history, I think it's important to frame it in that way, lest we lose what we mean by addressing current problems or current challenges in South Africa. I also want to say the pandemic is one of the pandemics that South Africa had experienced. Most of you would recall that the HIV/AIDS process has been also a huge thing in South Africa, right? Going back to the 80s, towards the 90s, again, this whole COVID issue mirrors the issue of HIV and AIDS discussion in South Africa, where the poor are the ones who were vulnerable, who could not get treatment. Pharmaceutical companies are dominating and so forth. Likewise, today we can see that the pharmaceutical companies are dominating the scarcity of vaccinations, and those who are poor are the ones that do not necessarily benefit from the inoculation process. So we can draw back, like sometimes we have a short memory, but I want to make a comparison or juxtapose two experiences of the HIV/AIDS pandemic as well as the COVID pandemic. I think in South Africa, we have a lesson that we can draw from in that regard, right? In terms of how this process has repeated itself again a few years later. So many people died during the process of the HIV and AIDS and the quest to try and find a cure, and different views of how the state and the government tried to respond to the issue. Likewise, the state and the government, and by but to a certain extent, the healthcare system had actually seen that we have very much limited resources and understanding in terms of how we respond to those issues. So I talk about this in a very broad, systemic, grand way, but it also has implications in terms of communities where people find themselves and are trying to respond to the immediate need of food, shelter, health, and many other needs that most people find themselves in, whether within the context of a church or broadly speaking within different communities that we find ourselves. So South Africa is still a very deeply polarized community. And in many ways, we've seen how churches with resources were able to adequately respond to people's needs, such as providing PPE, the personal protective equipment, providing food and shelter. And again, I mean, the other aspect that I want to emphasize here is that when the government introduced its first intense lockdown around March last year, it wanted people to isolate, right? But if you have to think about the concept of isolation, right, you have to think about the concept of space and intimacy and private area. So if you think about someone who stays in an informal settlement here in South Africa, in houses made out of corrugated iron sheets, where there is no proper sanitation, no roads and other things, you have to really think about how a single family staying in a one room, that a house made out of corrugated iron sheets, and they are staying maybe more than 8 people. How do you isolate in that context, right? How do you quarantine in that context? So I think the idea is that the state and the government has never thought about the processes of how you quarantine in such context or how you isolate in such context. So hence then the spread of the virus will continue to become even more because people find themselves in a deeply congested space and in spaces that cannot be adequately called a home. So churches are trying to respond to these needs. We also work very closely to an organization called Church Land Program that also tries to address the issue of land here in South Africa, which was a problem that was land taken away by settler colonials in 1913. To this day, land has not been adequately redistributed in South African context. But also a church owns huge acres of land. So how can a church now begin to open up its own land to create, say, affordable housing and other processes as well? So I highlight these matters because they are layered. They are very structural, but they're also very personal because how churches and community leaders are trying to respond to these issues. Ministers and church and community leaders ought to be given tools to then begin to reflect about the meaning of the impact that these pandemics, or in particular today we're talking about COVID-19, but this COVID-19 pandemic contributed towards the livelihood of people within communities, people within different churches. So I'm merely painting a picture of the South African context in terms of responding to the question of what has been the loss and how has this pandemic affected our communities in many ways.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that explanation of the layers and how you can talk about the big structural issues and it all impacts actual people with names and faces and families. And and that very helpful comparison with the AIDS pandemic and now COVID on top of that. That's all very helpful to understand your context. Karen, would you talk a little bit about your context there in Belfast?
Yeah. Well, I mean, before the pandemic kind of struck, and isn't it hard to believe it's 2 years? But Northern Ireland was beginning to adjust with the effects of Brexit. We've been hit pretty hard with that. It has caused more division. And even in recent weeks, it's caused our government to collapse over what's known as the protocol. So we were in a very fragile state to begin with, as our politicians and people were dealing with that. And then next thing, we were catapulted into the pandemic. One thing I want to say is that in the north of Ireland, it's actually we're quite small. There's only like 1.8 million of us here. And we've had something like 600,000 cases of COVID and something like 3,100 deaths, which may not seem like a lot, but listen, in comparison to being so small, it is huge, and every life matters, and every life, precious life, and someone who lost a loved one, our hearts grieve with them. But that's a similar figure to the number of people that we lost in our conflict here. And I guess the reason why I raise that is because things are beginning to lift here, and restrictions are beginning to lift. But I think we will be dealing with the trauma of this for quite some time. In those 2 years, and I know this is probably the same with you guys, but we couldn't visit our loved ones. We couldn't be with our loved ones who were dying. And that hit me on a personal level. I lost my mom during this season, simply because her cancer treatment was affected due to COVID. And even though she didn't die of COVID, I was, in a sense, along with thousands of others, robbed of precious time with her. And so I think that as we come out of this, and there was like a sense of weariness and tiredness at the beginning of stepping into the pandemic. There was a sense of togetherness. I think we were great in that. We put our shoulder to the wheel. We did what we needed to do. We applauded our health service. But I think as time went on, people got weary. People got heartbroken. People lost sometimes a sense of hope. And it was because we were losing our loved ones and precious time with our loved ones. And I think that now when we begin to come out of this wilderness, I think as faith leaders, we're going to have to deal with the trauma of what's just happened to us in 2 years. And I think that's really important to say. So in a sense, yes, we're coming out, but I think there will be an effect and a ripple effect through our society as we continue to walk through this. Lives were lost. Jobs were lost. People were put on furlough. People with no contract times were lost jobs. We have saw a rise in mental health issues, maybe because people, for all sorts of reasons, our waiting lists have increased. Our operations have been put on hold. Our health service is free in the NHS, but it is and has been described as being on the point and the brink of collapse. People during the COVID pandemic didn't maybe ring up if they felt unwell or discovered a lump. And so there's a backlog of calls that need to be updated in that. And also one of the things that we're starting to see now is the hike prices of our everyday living. And this has a huge effect on our families because electric has gone up horrendously. Prices are horrendous, and petrol and food. And so then this means there's an increase in food banks. So on one hand, there's been so much loss, and there's been such a depth of place where we need to restore and repair and revive our society and our communities. But I don't think, and yes, on one hand, we rejoice. We're still learning to live with COVID. We're beginning to see restrictions lifted. We're beginning to emerge out of this season. But we're coming out, I think, with the trauma and the after effects of that. And I think there's a lot of work for us to be doing in that, not least dealing with our own personal traumas. And listen, church leaders were not exempt. The reality is that next thing we were catapulted to a place where you needed to go online, which is great, but it's not so great if you're not very techie. And actually we noticed, and one of the Queen's University here in Belfast did a survey that actually a lot of our ministers were more stressed during this season. I know we'll talk about faith as we go on, but it's this ripple effect of the everyday effects of coming out of that wilderness season. And I think that it's an opportune time for us as faith leaders to really respond to that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, for the sake of time, so that we have enough time for the question and answer after the panel discussion, I'm going to ask you to simply choose the next topic that you want to speak to. If you want to speak about creating resilience, about your own faith and how it's been impacted, what gives you hope, or what resources, tools, and practices have been helpful to you as a leader, I'm just going to ask you to choose one of those that you want to speak to. So, yeah, Ofelia, go ahead.
Bueno, escuchando a
Listening to Karen and my brother, I feel privileged to a certain point, even though my own country has its problems and crisis, political crisis that's very big. I feel privileged to live in a country like the city of Mexico, where sorry, I missed the number. Huge city, but we have tried to respond to the pandemic, trying to help those who are poorest and most marginalized. Our medical centers, hospitals were never closed, even though in the politics it seemed as if that could happen. But there's been a huge effort to provide the assistance that people need. During my time of accompaniment of people, I have contemplated two things at a personal and social level: solidarity with people who were waiting for the news of their patients, and they could feel the presence of God moving in the midst of a situation that was so painful, the pandemic, that it's like being in the eye of a hurricane, and to be able to see the way in which the people accompanied each other to be resilient, and how God moved in incredible ways. And this is something that gives me a lot of hope, because sometimes we don't need to see things that are so spectacular in the small details, like children and adolescents who took baskets of fruit to the hospital in the midst of the cold winter, sometimes without a blanket, to take fruit or coffee or bread, or the way that the hospital personnel treated people, and social action also that came out of the faith communities, sister churches that helped us with resources to be able to buy food, to be able to share to our brothers and sisters who were in the most need. Because what you say about confinement, here the confinement was voluntary, and I need to say that many of us entered into confinement because of our situation. I'm not talking just on a personal level, but a social level, that the challenges that people were facing, and some because of fear. And people felt a lot of fear, and something that helped us to with resilience was to receive training, workshops, to work at our faith communities and how we work with our neighbors, etc. And that helped a lot. And also we received a lot of hope to be active, accompanying the people here in the community. Like I said, it's a very traditional area, and one of the things we did right away was to go visiting, and we took toys, games, and we prayed with people, and we shared food, and sometimes we had to be like medical people. And this came out of the faith community. When we went to the market, we would ask neighbors if they need something, and we would share from the little or the much that we had. And it was complicated and difficult. One thing that we had here at the level of our society is that we had to report on how many people were ill. We had reports on where we could go. There's a lot of orientation with regard to security in this sense. And there were situations, I want to speak a little bit of something that helped me a lot personally, and in terms of resilience as an opportunity within the movement of women doing theology from Latin America. We were always doing things. For example, there was a time in which every day, 5, 6, 8, we'd get news of people who were sick. We would pray. We would talk on the telephone. We would share our prayers with each other. We would help people who didn't have money to buy a medicine or something like that. And this is an opportunity, and not just for me, but with the testimony of many people. It helped a lot with resilience and hope. And to not take too much time here, I could mention a lot of things, but for me, something that I discovered that it's important to be resilient, to maintain hope and faith, is community. The community of faith. As Anabaptists as we are, it was this time that the faith community needed to be present. And in effect, we entered into the confinement, and we had to use technology, and we were glad that our daughter was with us and was able to teach us a lot. As a biologist, she also led workshops with the movement of Anabaptist women doing theology from Latin America, and she gave workshops to talk about how these vaccines function, what are these vaccines, and at local level as well as church level in Mexico also, but also in the level of the movement of women. And so all of these actions that take place in the faith community are valuable and contribute to resilience and faith. And because of this, I can say that, yes, we were sad. Yes, we have cried a lot with the losses that we experienced. And my brother-in-law died one day, my sister-in-law the next, in the hospital. They didn't want to be intubated, but we had to do this accompaniment with them, with their family, and at a family personal level, at a social level in our community, and also at the level that we experience as a coordinator of the Commission of Prayer with the movement. We encourage this hope and recognizing that God has control of history, even though the panorama seems gray and a huge challenge. And it seems like we have our hands tied when we connect our gifts within the community. God moves. And so we experience wonderful miracles that raised people up, miracles of comfort that we're here. There are many of us as a family, as a church, and also at Latin American level, that we're women who are always ready to serve. And there were projects that were born and activities to coordinate one way and another. Each year we do a liturgy of prayer, and we talked about the theme of the pandemic, and the point was hope. God has a control of history. And this has helped me a lot personally, and with my resilience and my faith and my trust, and in my own country. There's a political situation that's very difficult, and not just with our president, who is in solidarity with the poor and also very criticized, but also because of the corruption in the political area, violence, gender violence, that the voice of the disappeared, the criminality, not just in Mexico, but in Latin America is present. But something that has helped me is to read the prophet Habakkuk in the midst of the situation of conflict and between two powers, and ask God, until when, God? Until when? And not in a form of reproach, but of crying out at what we feel as human beings with faith in crisis. And God responded. And Habakkuk gives us evidence as a prophet in the actuality that God has control of history and God never arrives late. And so this word, this faith in Jesus who is present today in the midst of all this situation is what produces the hope. We have a revelation, the Lamb, and there always will be crises, and our responsibility as women, as pastors, in any ministry in which we're involved, that we can be salt and life, and we can illuminate wherever we are. This has been my experience as a Christian. It gives light. God uses my life. God is present, and God continues being present. And this I can say of resilience and faith and hope.
Wonderful. Thank you. I just love what you said, Ofelia, that when we connect our gifts and community, God moves. That is just, that's going to stay with me a while. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. Let's move on to MZ. How would you like to respond to either resilience, the impact on your faith, resources, practices for you as a leader, or anything else?
I think I'll follow Ophelia's footsteps. I'll take the resilience question. So I was thinking a lot about this question, and one of the things that comes to mind is two things. This practice of accompaniment, I think, is extremely crucial to the work we do as the Anabaptist Network in South Africa. So we assume a posture of not coming up with solutions, but rather accompanying people where they're at. We try to identify what we call sites of struggle, where people are reflecting intentionally about their own context, about their own lives, in light of scripture, in light of a particular faith tradition that they find themselves in. And we step into that space, into that site, and reflect alongside them. And our journey is to listen attentively, is to be curious, is to ask curious questions, is to linger more into the posture of listening, of discerning together with others. It is to explore what we call the plurivocal reflections, interpretations of scripture, as opposed to just one single voice. We want to explore different voices that people are seeing and hearing as we read scripture together, as we pray together. So this idea of accompaniment introduces a host of other practices. It moves away from this posture of domineering into a possible posture of multiplicity, of exploring what does it mean to include voices that have not been included in the past. And so we want to link into that space. The second thing it does is that it creates in us what a Ugandan theologian by the name of Emmanuel Katangole calls prescriptive haste. So most of the churches and organizations tend to be very much towards the mode or modality of prescriptive, right? We prescribe, we diagnose it, and we prescribe. And so Katangole warns us from this propensity to be lured by this practice of prescriptive haste. And so we try to linger, right? We try to say, problems emerge from where people define themselves in their own lived experience. We merely come as people who are in this journey of accompaniment. And so that's why our most theological practice is the practice of pilgrimage, right? The pilgrim people. So we are constantly on a journey. We are sojourners. And so for us, this process of pilgrimage is linked with this idea of accompaniment, right? The practice of hearing others, of slowing down and confront a different world that changes our own world. And so we take into consideration those elements. And so I think COVID-19, with its practices of isolation and quarantine, right, accelerated this idea of slowing down, right? It makes us to rethink and learn speed, to slow down, to enter into a mode of rest, into a mode of relaxing. And that's, I think, what I think comes out of one of the things that I think that comes out of the practices and that I've seen when we interact with different people from various places. So South Africa has about 9 provinces. In the US, you call them states. And these provinces, we work in 3. So there's one province called Western Cape, where Cape Town is based. And then the other province is called KwaZulu-Natal, where places like Durban, Pietermaritzburg are based. And another province called Gauteng, where I'm based, and a place called Johannesburg, and the capital city, Pretoria, is based. So there is that urban-rural divide. And so life in the urban context will definitely be very much different to the life in the rural context. And so we also work with a community of what has been termed or coined as the African indigenous churches, which work in a rural setting called Mthatha in South Africa, in Eastern Cape. And that context mostly will not have proper infrastructure. They will not have proper electricity, proper running water, and so forth. And those also will be people who, majority of the Bible school that we work with, they're called the Mennonite Bible School. It used to be called Bethany Bible School. Tries to equip leaders within these contexts of the African indigenous churches with basic pastoral and theological knowledge, right? How to basically order your church on a regular basis. And so they have been really hit hard by the pandemic. You would imagine that even though before the pandemic, their situation were already dire, right? But the pandemic sort of exacerbated that process. So we work alongside them, we accompany them to begin to see how we can explore what now we've called the practicing or the practices of alternative economies, right? Where even rural settings have their own ways of getting food, right? So there's land, there's other processes. So how do you then begin to make people think about how that land can feed them? But also how that land can also reproduce some sort of income in their own context. The South African unemployment rate is ridiculously high. We're sitting at 60, at about now going towards 41% unemployment rate, which is high. So the unemployment process in South Africa is very high, and the pandemic actually created even more processes of unemployment. Our economy can't even sort of grow with 1%, right? Even before the pandemic. And so you would imagine that people who are living within this context of the rural context would not even, I think 1 out of 10 will be able to come out of that context into sort of an urban context to find at least decent work. So here we're sitting with people who have at least land, and how can they best plow their land, and if their land can produce at least food, but also how can their land also be a proper shelter for them to live in. So that's one aspect of this element of accompaniment coupled with this practice of resilience, right? of trying to strive within and almost always an impossible possibility where someone can live, can be emancipated from that condition of suppression. So that's one element of this idea of rural-urban divide, where those who are within the urban context continue to struggle, continue to be resilient in their own context with limited resources. And ours is to try, for now, as the Anabaptist Network, is to try and do two things. One is to foster this idea of the practice of alternative economies. Two is to also then, alongside them, offer a much more rigorous theological education, theological formation to assist their leaders, but also to assist their own members of their own churches.
Thank you so much for sharing, Mzi. I'm sorry, I hate to cut you off. It's just we're going to run out of time
great.
before the workshop is over. But we're so privileged to work with you too in this kind of accompaniment work and alternative economies, slowing down, all the things you said, I think are really helpful tools for everyone across the world, listening deeply, all of those things. Yeah. All right. Reverend Karen, what do you want to speak to?
I want to say that I know the last time I highlighted our deep sense of loss and pain and sadness and jobs and health and so on as an effect of COVID. I would want to just say that here in Ireland, we're a very resilient people. We're extremely resilient. We've been through so much together. And I would want to pay tribute to the many people who put their shoulder to the wheel during this season and continue to in terms of peace and reconciliation. Community activists, youth workers, people of faith, of no faith, of different faiths. There is a great sense of let's build something better here. And that gives us hope. And I just want to, for a couple of moments, is just reflect, because I've been thinking about how these challenges for us as people of faith can turn into opportunities, particularly through the lens of the Anabaptist and the Mennonite mindset. And so I've been thinking of these tensions during this season in this wilderness, the tension of doing and being. We need to do things. We need to reach out to our neighbors. If there's ever a time to live out who is my neighbor, this is it. But I also think this was a season to teach us to be voices of hope, to be voices of joy, to be voices of peace, to be voices of a sense of togetherness and community. And so I think as faith leaders coming out of this, I think there's a huge tension on the doing and the being, and maybe the prophetic voices in this, certainly in this context, we had some fundamentalist views rising up, questioning whether God had said this as condemnation. And we need the voices of prophecy and prophetic voices to speak up and speak words of love and compassion and grace as we come out of this wilderness. I think the tension as well between clergy-led and community-led is something that we need to look at, if anything, being online. And as I said earlier, something like 46% of faith leaders said that they felt extremely stressed. But on top of that, a lot of leaders started to think that maybe doing stuff online made them reevaluate their leadership skills, that there could be this shift from being only clergy-led to being community-led. Because if anything, volunteers needed to step up. And we saw that in all our services, maybe because they were at home and they were isolating and in lockdown. But so there's this tension of clergy-led and being community-led, and learning as leaders in this to share the workload, that we're not on our own, that we don't need to handle the stress of being faith leaders in the midst of this. I think also financial gain and simple living is something I've been thinking about. I know a lot of churches lost out financially, but I just wonder, is Jesus trying to refocus on us what it means to be a people of living simply, of living with less, of what we do with our money? I just think as we came out of this season and reflect through the lens of the Anabaptist and Mennonites, that's something for us, all of us, to think about. And then the tension of life inside the church walls and life outside the church walls. And listen, if there's ever a time that we need to turn on its head this whole idea of come to church, come to us, we need to reclaim the idea of going to people, to being where the least of these are, going to where the hurt and the grieving is. And I think that is something that maybe God is shining a light on for all of us. I work outside the church walls. I'm a champion of church, and I love what church does and what we all do as a community, but we need to be in the streets. We need to be with people, and we need to champion the least of these in our community. And so that kind of gives me the whole idea of this document that was published here in Northern Ireland by our Irish Churches Council called "We Are Something Other Than a Building." And listen, I just welcome that document, because I think, if this is something that is good that comes out of this, then that needs to be celebrated, that we are more than a building. That maybe from our point of view, obviously with meeting online, completely not techie at all, so this is all new to us. We do life with people who feel they don't fit in church. Northern Ireland states that 80% of people say that they're spiritual, but less than 30% go to church. So there is a disillusionment and a disconnect from the institution. And so we want to get into that middle ground, get into that, what it means to be an alternative faith voice and an alternative community in that. And so during lockdown, we did a simple thing. We set up a Facebook group, a closed group, a place where you could come and have some spiritual reflection, grab a coffee in the comfort of your home, and learn together, have conversation. And when we just set it up, there was over 200 people joined it. So there's something that God is doing that reminds us it doesn't have to be within our building. And I think as people and as ministers of faith, we owe it to our faith to take the time for years to come to, yes, rebuild, restore, repair, revive our communities, but to reevaluate what does it mean to be leaders coming out of this, dealing with trauma and loss and unemployment. So many lives, 3,000 lives in Northern Ireland lost, 3,000 precious lives who didn't get to see their loved ones have that funeral, people's jobs. And you and I are the messengers of hope, and we get to be in that. And I think that's a great opportunity for us. I really do.
Yes, and amen. Oh my goodness. You guys have just inspired me so much and touched me deeply with your stories. You have a prophetic edge, of course, too, and so many good reminders of what we're about. So we're going to turn our recording off here and continue with live conversation.